Welcome, everyone. I'm very happy to introduce you to this session discussing China's colonial boarding schools in Tibet. This is a report that's been put together by the Tibet Action Institute, and you can find their work on the web at tibetaction.net. A lot of other reports as well. I want to let you know that you can put your questions and comments into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And after we hear from the presentations, I'll look in that box and pass some questions on to the panelists. My name is Andy Nathan. I'm a faculty member at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia. And I'd like to introduce the speakers. The first speaker is going to be Lhadon, who's a co-founder and director of the Tibet Action Institute. She can explain how that institute works. She used to work as executive director of the Students for a Free Tibet International and led the high-profile global campaign to condemn China's rule of Tibet in the lead up to and during the 2008 Beijing Olympics. She has been awarded the first annual James Lawson Award for Nonviolent Achievement by the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict and a Democracy Award from the National Endowment for Democracy on behalf of the Tibet Action Institute in 2018. So she'll be our first presenter. And then we're going to hear from Freya Putt, who's Director of Strategy at the Tibet Action Institute and the lead author of the report that we're going to be hearing about on China's colonial boarding school system in Tibet. And then we're going to hear from Dr. Jia Luo, who's born in Amdo, Tibet, which is part of Gansu province in Tibet. And he was a professor in the Tibetan Language and Culture Department at China's Northwestern University for Nationalities, and later on received a master and PhD in educational sociology from the University of Toronto. And then we're going to hear from Tenzin Dorjee, who's a PhD candidate in our Department of Political Science here and a senior researcher and strategist at the Tibet Action Institute, and the Stephanie G. Newman Fellow in Comparative Defense Studies at the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies here at Columbia. So this is a very dramatic, path-breaking, important report on something that is not well enough known, very not known much in the West that's going on in Tibet. So I'm just very happy that we have a chance to bring it to the attention of our listeners here. So to remind, please put your questions and comments in the Q&A box. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Lhadon Tethong to introduce the report. Lhadon, it's over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Andy. Thank you for supporting this event. And thank you to Weatherhead East Asian Institute for hosting us. So before I'll just speak briefly and I'll just talk about our high-level findings in the report. But one note before we begin, I want to just be clear that when we speak about Tibet today, we are speaking about Tibet as Tibetans know it, which is the three historical provinces of Uzang, Kham, and Amdo, the entire Tibetan plateau, and approximately 7 million Tibetans. We are not just speaking about Tibet Autonomous Region, what China calls the Tibet Autonomous Region, which has a population, I think now, of 3.5 million, and was created by the Chinese government as an administrative region, the Chinese Communist Party, in 1965. And I think, it's confusing for people. And just to be clear, the majority, actually, over 50% of Tibetans live outside of the TAR. I also wanted to point out that today is the 33rd birthday of the Panchen Lama, Tibet's 11th Panchen Lama. So it's really fitting that we're here talking about children today, the plight of Tibetan children, because the Panchen Lama was himself 6 years old only in 1995 when the Chinese authorities disappeared him along with his parents shortly after the Dalai Lama announced him as the official reincarnation of the 10th Panchen Lama, who had died in 1989. Of course, to this day, Beijing refuses to say where he is or bring him out publicly. They claim only and ridiculously that he's being kept somewhere secret for his own protection. But I think it's fitting that we're speaking today about the nearly, or at least 80% of Tibetan children who have been taken and put in these colonial boarding schools in Tibet, because in doing so, I think the Chinese government is trying to do what they were doing when they kidnapped the Panchen Lama all those years ago. They were attempting to sort of fundamentally alter a core aspect of Tibetan identity. The three pillars we say of religion, language, and culture or way of life. And the idea then with the Panchen Lama as now is really about fundamentally changing Tibetan identity so as to control the future of Tibet and to eliminate resistance to Chinese rule in Tibet. So right to our report now. Our work on the report started about a year and a half ago when a Tibetan researcher estimated 900,000 Tibetan children by his accounting were living in residential boarding schools in Tibet. And that number was just shockingly high to us. I really couldn't believe it. We were, of course, hearing accounts of Tibetans from inside Tibet who were saying that more children were being sent to boarding schools, often against their parents' wishes, including very young children. We were hearing of 4- and 5-year-olds being sent to boarding school. But the information blackout and the lockdown of Tibet, especially since the 2008 March uprising, is so total and so complete. It's so difficult to get news and information out. There are no journalists there. Tibetans can't even escape anymore. I think Human Rights Watch says where 2,200 Tibetans used to escape on average every year on foot over the Himalayan mountains into Nepal and India up until 2008. That number has just completely dwindled to a trickle. I think the number for 2019 is 18 Tibetans made it out. And they used to be the source of so much information. The escaping Tibetan refugees were the source of so much of the information that we could, get a real sense of what's happening inside Tibet. And of course, it's so dangerous now for Tibetans to communicate from inside Tibet and tell people what's happening outside that we really were having a hard time understanding the full picture on the ground. But we were clear that the attack on the Tibetan people's right to use language in daily life, especially in the education system, the attack by Beijing on Tibetan language was escalating. And Tibetans in Tibet have been fighting these policies for decades, but after 2008, as they intensified, we were really, blown away by the resistance of Tibetans inside protesting the switch to Chinese medium instruction, Mandarin instruction in almost all schools in Tibet. And so the report, we started to look into this issue, and we were shocked, of course, to find that as we pieced together the shards of information that we could find, that 800 to 900,000 Tibetan children, at least in all of historical Tibet, so representing nearly 80% of all Tibetan school children ages 6 to 18, are now separated from their families and living in colonial boarding schools. And this number does not include the 4- and 5-year-olds that we know in rural areas are being made to live in boarding preschools. So these children are losing their ability to speak Tibetan, and they're losing their connection to their Tibetan cultural roots because they're separated from their families, isolated from their families and their communities. They're, of course, forbidden from practicing religion or Buddhism in school. they're cut off from authentic Tibetan culture beyond, of course, what the Chinese Communist Party approves of, which seems to be at this point wearing Tibetan clothes and maybe dance and some song for exercise or for display. They're being taught almost entirely in Chinese, increasingly by Chinese teachers from Chinese textbooks that reflect, of course, Chinese life and history and culture and values, and that completely deny Tibet's own rich and ancient history and culture. And then, of course, on top of this, they're subjected to intense political indoctrination, even at the very youngest ages. And this, curriculum says what they're learning every day and these long, long days of school that they attend. And through this indoctrination is that they must be loyal to the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese nation above all else. And most Tibetan parents have no choice but to send their children away to live in these state-run schools because all the alternatives are unavailable to them. So local village schools have been shut down. Tibetan monastery schools, Tibetan private schools, they're being shut down, and also it's just there aren't as many of them. And the parents really have no option but to, if they want their children to receive a modern education, which they do, then they have to send their kids away. And there are parents who resist, and those who resist are harassed, they're threatened with financial penalties, they're told their children will be barred from joining later grades in school, or that their next children who've yet to join won't be allowed to join. So through all these different ways, they're compelled to send their children away. And of course, I think it's important to note that Tibetans will know that this policy is coming from the highest levels of the Chinese Communist Party and the central government, and any kind of resistance will be could be seen as sort of political, and they could be really severely punished for all they want to do is keep their kids home, but they could be, seen to be that this is some kind of political fight or subversion of the state or something like that. So the insidious nature of this plan, isolating children from their families in order to erase their identity and replace it with a Chinese identity, it's disturbing beyond words, and it's clear that it's developed at the highest levels of the Communist Party. The decision on accelerating the development of ethnic education from 2015 was issued by the State Council, calling for the so-called minority areas officials to strengthen boarding school construction and to achieve the goal that students of all ethnic minorities will study in a school, live in a school, and grow up in a school. That's 2015. I just want to point out that after the consolidation of schools all across China, in 2012, an outcry from people across China led to the State Council in 2012 saying, in principle, all schools should be local and children should not board, especially very young children. So this decision on ethnic education completely goes in the other direction, very obviously targeting so-called minority students. And I won't say much more than this, so we can talk more in the Q&A, but I just wanted to say I have a 5-year-old, and I cannot imagine having to send him away at this young age. I think anyone who has young children knows how much they need us in daily life. And not only that, but as a Tibetan with my husband and our family and our community, his grandparents, his 97-year-old grandfather here, every day we are transmitting our culture, our values, our way of life, of our ancestors, of our family, of our people to him. And to think that if I was in Tibet, especially in a rural area, that not only would I have to send him away, which I can't bear the thought of, but that this important time of his life, this critical foundational time of his life and the development of who he is, his psychology, that all of our influence over him would be denied, is really obviously outrageous. It's deeply disturbing. And I think as a Tibetan born and raised in Canada, I can say it haunts me what Canada did to First Nations people and children with these residential schools. I so acutely feel, though they're different situations, I so acutely feel after researching and writing this report with my colleagues, how dire the situation is. We're talking about the entire future of Tibet. So many of our children, perhaps 1 in 7 Tibetans, now living children in the state's control in these residential boarding schools. So I'll stop there. That's just the high level look at this, and I'll pass it on to, or back to Andy and to Freya.
Thank you. You said 1 in 7 Tibetan children, is that right?
If the number is as high as 1 million, we're definitely, our estimate 800,000 to 900,000 Tibetan children is safe. With the 4 and 5-year-olds who aren't counted in that number, we're getting towards 1 million. And that would be 1 in 7 Tibetans in
1 in 7 Tibetan persons or 1 in 7 Tibetan children?
persons.
Persons. So just to nail this down, what percentage of children of in that?
At least 80% of all 6 to 18.
Okay, that is a very high number. Mm-hmm. A higher number than 1 in 7. I think that 80% is the important number. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Great. Freya, let's see what you can. You, by the way, Freya, can you describe the place of the Tibet Action Institute within the spectrum of Tibetan exile organizations, so we have a sense of your special work?
Sure. Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Weatherhead, for hosting us. Tibet Action Institute was formed just over 10 years ago, more 12 years ago now, to try to fill a hole that we saw, the founders saw that, and other founders at that time in the international Tibet movement, which was twofold. It was, on the one hand, to provide digital security training and make sure that Tibetans were able to use all the new technologies that were evolving at that point that had made such a huge difference to activism and communication during the 2008 Beijing Olympics, when the world could see, when Tibetans rose up in Tibet, we could actually see what was happening, and there were pictures and there were stories coming out because Tibetans were able to tell those stories via their phones mostly. So trying to make sure that that space, that rare space that had opened up, was continuing to be able to be used by Tibetans, but also Tibetan activists in exile were under insane attacks at that time from China online, with viruses, with robocalls that were jamming up cell phones so they couldn't be used during key events and protests and things like that. So it was to try to provide digital security training and technology innovation for the movement, and then also to take a step back and be able to do more sort of big picture strategizing and training and planning to help the movement increase its effectiveness and move faster toward its long-term goals. So that's what we do. We have done some research, but this report was actually really a step out of our usual work for us. We first started, as Lhadon mentioned, trying to corroborate the numbers that a Tibetan in exile had published, that close to 1 million kids were in these schools. And we were trying to look at the numbers and just verify them, and realized that this is a huge and awful situation that mostly had developed without getting much attention. And that is because China has done such an effective job despite all the great technologies that are being used, but they've done such an effective job blocking people physically from going to Tibet, journalists or researchers, censoring people's communications inside, and also mainly by instilling such a sense of fear for Tibetans inside that people are afraid to talk. And there's been a real increase in the last few years of criminalization of just really basic things. So talking about language and Tibetan language, which there used to be space for, now it's become something that people are going to jail for long periods of time. Or communicating with people abroad has always been a little bit risky, but now people are actually being sentenced to prison for it. And tortured and the whole works. So things have just really ratcheted up, and the boarding schools are part of that. And the situation having reached this point when a large majority of Tibetan students are in these schools, and really most people internationally didn't know. So that's what we do and how we came to be looking at these numbers. And I will just speak briefly about the details of how we got this information, which wasn't easy to find. Lhadon mentioned, of course, how China has divided Tibet up into all these different administrative regions. And when you're doing research, especially for numbers, it makes it really difficult to find what's happening to the population as a whole. There's the Tibet Autonomous Region, but there's also so many prefectures and counties, Tibetan autonomous prefectures and counties in Shanghai and Sichuan and Gansu and Yunnan. And even though China there are some propaganda pieces about these schools, showing, of course, how great they are and how much students love them. There's no single place or no numbers associated with those articles or TV pieces. So we had to look through the official government statistics at Chinese statistical yearbooks, the statistical bulletins and communiques from prefectures and counties, data from provincial and prefectural education departments, and some that appeared in research by academics based in China to find these numbers. And we arrived at the number that we have in the report by estimating the number of Tibetan students in a particular area, which we did by taking the percentage of the population that was reported to be Tibetan in the Chinese census and multiplying it by the total student number for that area. Then we found the percentage of students in that same area that were reported to be enrolled in boarding school. And we applied the percentage that was boarding to the total number of Tibetan students in the area to get the total Tibetan students boarding. So we did this for all the different areas that we could find and added them together. And that's what gave us the minimum number of 806,218. And of course, giving that very specific number, we all know that Chinese statistics aren't perfect, are very far from perfect, but we think this is a very conservative number, actually. As Lhadon mentioned, it assumes that the percentage of Tibetan students and Chinese students that are in boarding schools is the same as the percentage of Tibetans and Chinese in the population of each area as a whole. But we know that the Colonial boarding school program actually targets Tibetans and other so-called ethnic minorities specifically. The data is also a few years old now, and we know from reports from individuals that the boarding schools have been growing and that local schools have been shut down during this time. And it also doesn't account for the preschool boarding, which we don't have numbers for, but we do know is also growing. And so the scale of the colonial boarding schools that this number indicates, this estimate indicates, was also borne out by the other research that we did. Of course, as I mentioned before, it is extremely risky for Tibetans inside Tibet to be talking about this, to be talking to people based abroad about this, but we did get some firsthand accounts from inside Tibet. For example, one person talked about their village, how they were trying to hold on to their local school instead of having it shut down and their kids sent to boarding school. They were visited repeatedly by authorities, and he described a village meeting with 2 township heads, the education head from the county, and about 6 police officers. They made threats like, "Today is the last day we'll come. If we have to come back tomorrow, it won't be good. If you don't listen to us, we'll squeeze or pressure you one by one. That's easy for us to do." One Tibetan teacher said that in their area, all 4-year-olds have to be sent to boarding school. And they described, in their words, usually there are very few Tibetan teachers. The majority are Chinese. So teachers only speak in Mandarin and conduct all school curriculum in Mandarin, including nursery rhymes and bedtime stories. When the children join primary school at age 7, hardly any of them can speak Tibetan. We also gathered some statements from Tibetans in exile who'd gone to earlier versions of these schools to try to get some sense of the picture of what the experience might be like. It's very difficult to get that information about the current schools. And the stories from Tibetans in exile showed just the pervasiveness of neglect and bullying, a really regimented schedule, and extreme loneliness and isolation, separated from their families and their communities. And lastly, we looked at research that was done by scholars inside China, both Tibetan and Chinese, and reports and articles from human rights organizations and academics abroad. This included some investigations into the psychological impact of the boarding schools and the social and emotional harm that children are enduring. And for me, it's this last element of what's happening that's most deeply disturbing. Lhadon was mentioning the parallels with Canada. I'm also Canadian, and I live in a little city called Kelowna. And about a year ago, as we were realizing that it truly was a fact that more than three quarters of Tibetan children, Tibetan students, 6 to 18-year-olds, are in these colonial boarding schools, separated, forced to be separate from their families. It was at that time that news broke internationally about 215 unmarked graves being found in a town called Kamloops at a former residential school site. And Kamloops is 2 hours north of me. So that really brought home in a very stark and sharp way for me the parallels here. So residential schools in Canada, like the US, and the slightly different system in Australia, it was a really explicit part of a broader strategy to eliminate Indigenous identities. And we all have heard in recent years as more and more of the horrors have come to light. And we know that the trauma that these places, that children endured in these places is really still echoing through the generations today and will for many generations to come. So when our countries and we as people like myself, descendants of settlers here, we're reckoning with these atrocities, it is just horrifying to see that Xi Jinping is pursuing a strategy that's quite obviously modeled on those of our colonial countries, and including the use of these colonial boarding schools as a tool to deliberately break social ties and starve Tibetan language and culture. So without talking more, I will turn it over to Dr. Jia Luo to talk more about this.
Thank you, Freya. Yeah, Dr. Gallo, please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Andy, hosting this important panel. I'm going to present as Lhadon and Freya detailed the scoop of the school education as the onboarding. Now I'm going to little bit of focusing on the theoretical aspect from the educational sociologist perspective, and the education part is far beyond significant change that making the school education making in Tibet. This is also the shadow of the international Tibetan study and the global Asian study. There's a few scholars just focusing on this issue, while this is making the significant change of the Tibetan society. I will focus on the what defines the school, how to see boarding school. For example, the objective of the education, what is the objective of education, and the content of the curriculum and the language of the instruction and the outcome of the schooling. I will focus on those for a basic element. The rule of the school basically, naturally, such as Professor Dear Kim asserts that the rule of the school is to inculcate the value and the norms in supporting the current dominant structure of the society. And it's a political ideology, and the schooling is a key player in an agent of political socialization. This is who managing, who informing the education that the rule of the education should play. And then the compulsory education aspect, the expert in the early years, they say the basic goal of the public school are to transmit the culture and socialize the youth. It is very often that politics, education, economic, and the social complexity filled with minority education policy. So clearly, as Lhadon and Freya detailed the scope of the boarding school in Tibet, across Kham, Amdo, Uyghur, Tibetan region, they're not transmitting Tibetan culture and not the socialized Tibetan youth, it's the synthesizing as a Chinese youth. And that's the compulsory education in Tibetan society has been playing a role that is transforming Chinese political ideology more than transmitting Tibetan culture. In this sense, compulsory education has less effective role to popularize the standards, the Tibetan language and the term. In addition, the student is required to spend 90% of the time, school time, for national curriculum, which with low quality Tibetan translation from Chinese content has been constantly transforming mixed political ideology and limited the traditional Tibetan culture. And then based on that, how those carried out, it's based on curriculum. Who control the curriculum, who making the curriculum, who be able to change the curriculum, obviously in the colonial government system of China. What is included and what is excluded in curriculum often defined as a question of whose education is. And as the worldview representing the content of the ethno-cultural identity in school education, curriculum plays such a role in transforming knowledge and reproducing social cultural norm. And it's personal identity throughout the multi-agent interaction in the classroom. We kids spend the daytime 8 hours in the school like that. And then the curriculum issue that we're needed to apply this, the curriculum study says there's the hidden curriculum. The Tibetan curriculum is a planned curriculum and also the received curriculum. What we're receiving in the Chinese culture is not our own culture. And then the strategy for the curriculum change and control, we have less study on that, how to change the colonial curriculum or how to control the curriculum for our kids. We have no power, we have no strategy at that time over the last 30 years. And then politicization of the curriculum, using the curriculum politicizing. This is a state curriculum, you have to learn, you have to obey it, without making any adaptation from the Tibetan culture. And then the resistance to change. Over the last 30 years, we haven't done this about the resistance to change the curriculum, actually, because the lack of the insight or the social movement theory for how to change the curriculum, colonial curriculum system. The ideological domination, obviously. The Chinese government and the party system is the main dominant to informing the curriculum. Often they politicize or sentence the people who criticize them or who question their ideology. And then the problem with the language study we hear is that China never sees this language, the Tibetan language, as a resource. They often see the Tibetan language as a right and the language as a conflict. The mostly third parts, they see the Tibetan language or other minority languages as a conflict with their language. Then there is an element of the identity. We have a core element, identity, and other elements. We often say those elements, culture, religion, and the other stuff, but mainly it's the politics. Who should I be? They have no choice. Throughout the school, they inform you the way they design it. And then please move, next slide. A few thoughts on this. As we know, there's a dialectical relationship between language and the society. The society is created by language and the society is its language. It's the two sides of a coin. You cannot separate the society. You cannot remove the language without keep their culture or identity. See, the outcome of the schooling is we, over the last year, 30 years, we follow the model one, Chinese as a one subject model, and the model two is a Tibetan as a one subject model. Now, since 2015, the ultimate shift to the pure colonization or sanitization. There is no Tibetan language in the culture, in the curriculum, in the language of the instruction. This is the idea for my previous research. And then the second, please move. I did my research throughout my doctoral study. I applied the pure sociological theory of the structured theory to the Tibetan education and the society. That's explored an enormous issue that were never studied, never done the study, under researched. Throughout this book study, I found that there are three forms of education system in Tibet. and the schools education, monastic education, and oral education, and the school education as a boarding school, this undermining both monastic education and the oral education system. And then there's a two model of the society, the oral society and the literate society. Each has run the different pedagogy and the language. For the time, saving the time, I'm going to skip it, and then later if we have time, I can come back on that. So oral society and literate society, education for the oral education and the monastic education, the language itself, oral language. The majority of the Tibetan population is lived in the oral society and having the oral education. The literate society having the written and oral both. Now, the relation of the education to the social reproduction. I applied Ian Robertson's theory, and I added my part. Society constituted by 4 elements. Those 4 elements reproduced through education. And then, as you can see, from the sociological aspect, we see this is a curriculum content. I'm going to analyze as an example. From the grade 1 to 9, there's no enough the content to produce a Tibetan agent, even in the oral society. Please move to the next. The critical relation of the educational to social transformation. I'm gonna quote the fisherman's argument. Says, without the intergenerational mother tongue transmission, no language maintenance is possible. So this is the implication from sociology education, from my research, the social cultural reproduction of the Tibet are under the full control of the Chinese government and its Communist Party via schooling. And the destroying the macro social structure and the sub-fragmenting micro social structure and the unity. In terms of China's compulsory education policy and its colonial curriculum, boarding school functioning as an axis of the rooting up the continuity of Tibetan history and civilization. And as a result of all above situation will cause more resistance action and conflict. Thus, the colonial boarding school in Tibet is a failure of the school education. By the time, let's end up here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jia Luo. Now, Tenzin Dorjee, Tendor, would you like to speak?
Sure. Thank you so much, Andy. Thanks to Julie and others who worked really hard to put this event together, and Weatherhead for hosting it. So in the beginning, Lhadon mentioned the targeting, how the Chinese government targets Tibetan faith, language, and the way of life. I just wanted to focus a little bit more on language and give a sense of what is at stake, what we are talking about, what we might be losing, what is being endangered, right? And there are 2 ways for a language to die. Broadly speaking, I would say one is as the unintended result of natural or structural causes, like demographic decline or cultural domination, market forces, and there was a general notion that half of the world's languages might actually disappear in the next 100 years or so if no action is taken to protect them. Another way for a language to die is when a hegemonic state decides that a particular language must die. There's nothing natural or structural about such a death. It is intentional, designed, and systematic. And the policies that the Chinese government is implementing in Tibet indicate that this is the kind of death the Chinese government envisions for the Tibetan language. And the policies we have heard from Dr. Jia Luo, from the report that Lhadon and Freya discussed, this is the sense we get, right? Now, I want to emphasize that Tibetan is not one of the, I hope you can't hear the screaming outside.
We hear it. They're trying to
Yeah.
take her away to boarding school. So
Exactly. But at least I'm not the one, making the child cry. I have this alibi, so I'll be okay. So now I want to emphasize that Tibetan is not one of the hundreds of thousands of languages that are headed for natural extinction or feared to be headed for that kind of end. If it's left to its own devices, or if left to the mercy of the market, Tibetan is actually a highly competitive and perfectly healthy language that has incredible intrinsic value as well as instrumental value. And I just want to share an observation that I had a few months ago. I was in India a few months back, and I was visiting Bailakupi in South India, where the largest Buddhist monasteries in Exile are based. They're probably the largest Buddhist monasteries anywhere right now. And I spent some time in Sera Monastery, and it was amazing to see there were monks from everywhere, right? Not just Tibetan monks, but monks from Nepal, Ladakh, Bhutan, Arunachal, Mongolia, Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong. There were monks even from America and China. And these monks, they are not studying Buddhism in English or any other language. They are studying in Tibetan. Because for someone who wants to study Buddhist philosophy in all its entirety and access all the three canonical baskets of teachings, which include the direct teachings of the Buddha, the commentaries by classical scholars, and the tantric texts, for somebody who wants to do that, there is no better institution of learning in the world than these Tibetan monastic colleges. So these foreign students who are there, they spend years learning and mastering Tibetan so that they can engage with the texts, not only by reading and reciting, but also by engaging in the Nalanda style debate tradition, right? So much of that tradition is, not just literary, it's oral. Now, remember, these are refugee institutions. The monastic colleges I'm talking about in Bailakupi, they are refugee institutions in exile without the kind of financial or material access that are available to citizens of sovereign states. And still, all these people from around the world want to go there and study. So this made me realize that if we let market forces decide things, then Tibetan as a language is actually destined to thrive and flourish, because not only Tibetans, but non-Tibetans are interested in learning it. And in fact, we know that in the major universities in the West, we know that faculties would be hesitant to claim that they have a world-class East Asian or Central Asian department if they don't have a Tibetan language program. There is demand for it, right? So the only reason this language is under threat right now is because of active state intervention aimed at containing, sabotaging, and destroying it in its own homeland. And what we are warning about here is not just macro level policies or abstract generalities inferred from the data. We have seen the impact these policies are having on the ground, on individuals and families in real time. I was able to speak with a Tibetan student who has been attending one of these state-run boarding schools. And without giving too many details, I asked them, what language do you use to speak with your classmates, not during, but outside of class? And they said Chinese. And I said, are there any classmates, in your class, are there any students who are actually Chinese? No, they're all Tibetan, right? And still they talk to each other in Chinese. Then I asked them, what's your first language right now? What's your strongest language? And they said Chinese. So the thing is, before enrolling in this boarding program, their first language, the student I spoke with, their first language was Tibetan. 1 to 2 years into the program, now Chinese is their first language. And this is precisely what the boarding school policy was meant to accomplish. This will be the first generation of Tibetans ever to speak Tibetan as a second language, or ever to speak to each other in Chinese en masse, like, at a massive level. If these boarding schools continue to operate the way they do, there's no doubt we can see what the next generation will be like. And this is the possibility that really terrifies Tibetans right now, Tibetan families, Tibetan elders, Tibetan leaders, Tibetan activists, Tibetan parents, grandparents. And one of the most disruptive, most drastic, devastating thing that this entire boarding school system is doing is not just cutting off children's links with their parents, but cutting their links with their grandparents, right? We actually, 2015 or 16, we actually heard another story while speaking to one of our close friends. We have family members in Lhasa. They had an experience where one young kid, after spending a couple of months in one of these institutions, came back home and no longer able to speak in Tibetan, only speaking in Chinese, which meant they were no longer able to speak to their grandparents. And the grandparents were devastated, right? Because in the Tibetan family kind of hierarchy, you have grandparents who only speak Tibetan, no Chinese at all. Then you have Tibetan parents who speak Chinese as a second language. And now you have a new generation who's speaking Chinese as a first language, and Tibetan, if they speak it at all, will be their second language. That's the most terrifying thing. And lastly, one thing we often hear is that Tibetan civilization, with its Buddhist as well as pre-Buddhist cultures, is one of the great ancient civilizations that are still alive today. And that's true. All of that civilizational edifice is built on the foundation of the Tibetan language. Once the language is removed, the entire structure will collapse. And this is precisely the colonial vision that Beijing tries really hard to fulfill right now. And it's also the genocidal nightmare that Tibetans are fighting to prevent. I'm sorry to end on such a positive note, but hopefully we'll have more cheerful things to discuss in the Q&A. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you, Tendor. We have 3 good questions in the Q&A already, so I want to encourage people to go ahead and add to that. Before I get to it, I want to ask a couple of things myself. Tendor has emphasized the sort of high-level loss that is involved here of the language, and from the language, the civilization, the culture, the religion. Lhadon at the beginning emphasized just the pain of a parent losing a child into this system, and the damage that's done to the children. And Lhadon and Freya both mentioned the Canadian and American and Australian residential schools. So one thing I want to ask is that comparison of the residential schools in Tibet with the Canadian schools, because as Freya mentioned, that the graves that were discovered that shocked her and shocked all of us. Do we have any knowledge? We probably can guess that in these residential schools, there's a lot of abuse, because that kind of thing happens. And they're probably underfunded and understaffed, and the kids may be difficult to control because they're suffering trauma and so on, conditions that tend to lead to abuse. But do we actually have evidence of the level of abusiveness in these schools? Does anybody know the answer to that?
So I could start and just say, so certainly all of the Tibetans that we spoke with who testified to their past experience, so sort of the boarding schools before this very current system, Tibetans who went to boarding schools in Tibet, they have, some pretty harrowing stories across the board in terms of the conditions and the neglect and the abuse, psychological, emotional, physical, sexual, all of it. So that we included those in this report because we felt it was really important for people to understand, especially those earlier experiences. Right now, the information is so hard to get about exactly what the conditions are in the schools. And certainly what we can see online is a lot, through whatever's available publicly, a lot of fancy new buildings, good food being served. So we can see, at least in the propaganda, the conditions look pretty darn good compared to even what these Tibetans who went to boarding schools in the past in Tibet have told us. But we don't know because we don't have access, and China doesn't give anyone access to Tibet in any meaningful way to look and to ask. And so we know all those challenges. We do know, and we have heard about stories of right now there's one that we're just looking into. It sounds like there is a good deal of abuse and neglect, as there are, I guess, in any school system that's residential, but also where you have no oversight from, right? It's not like communities have any oversight. It's not like we have I have my parent-teacher association here, and I elected my school board committee rep in Somerville, Massachusetts. It's not like the Tibetans have any of that. So they have to trust their children to the state. Too often, there may be Tibetan principals and whatnot, but they don't have a lot of control, from what we understand now, over the teachers that they are coming in, and over obviously what's taught. But it is clear that the conditions maybe look good, but we really can't say for certain what is happening inside, and that's a big part of why we need access to the schools, independent third parties, human rights investigations, all of it. I don't know if anyone wants to add. Oh, and then the connection to the Canadian residential schools and others. I think one, just to be clear, we called this colonial boarding school system for a couple of reasons, but one very obvious one is that the residential school story in Canada, the issue is just absolutely, it's an acute public, national, global issue story right now that people are focused on, and that to us is long overdue and critically important, and an ongoing evolving situation that we would never want to take anything away from and try to come up with some direct comparisons that say this is exactly the same, because it's not. But what we do see in residential schools, so we call them colonial boarding schools, but they are residential schools. That's technically, when you go and live in these schools, they're known as residential boarding schools or residential.
So I think you're answering one of the questions in the Q&A, is that right?
Yeah.
So let me identify that question for the listeners. It comes from Kalden.Sempa, and that person says, thank you. I don't think that the participants, the audience, can see the Q&A. At least I'm assuming that you can't. So I'll read you the question. So the question says, thank you very much for this detailed report and for this talk. Was there any hesitation about using the term residential to these boarding schools? And so Lhadon says that's the official term. And the questioner goes on, as a Canadian Tibetan, it seems to me a bit spurious of a comparison, especially when it's estimated that 25,000 Indigenous children have died in residential schools here in Canada, that is. Why use such similar language? It seems irresponsible to have such a close overlap in how we discuss these two undoubtedly colonial issues. So Kalden agrees they're colonial, and questioned whether you should use the word residential. And your answer is, well, first of all, they are residential, but secondly, that the Chinese government calls them residential. But maybe you could expand, for my sake, why you use the word colonial. Not that I disagree with it, but ostensibly, Tibet is not a colony of the PRC, so why do you use the word colonial?
I'm going to let Tendor answer that. It's one of his favorites. And Gela, Dr. Gelo also.
Gela, yeah, also feel free to jump in, but I'll just quickly say that, yeah, I think one of the greatest achievements of the Chinese government's propaganda strategy has been the ability to convince the world that Tibet is not a colony of China. Because once we examine the realities of the situation, it is very much, there are lots of elements that are actually very colonial. And, one of the main markers of a colonial distinction would be, like the difference between the people in the metropole who are citizens and then the people in the colony who are subjects. And that's very much the case with Tibet. What we have is one country, two systems kind of situation in the opposite direction, where Tibetans put up with so much more repression, even given the fact that China has become much more repressed for Chinese people proper. Tibetans just put up with several times more repressive measures on a daily basis, right? They are living in a different world in that sense. And right now, like another really easy to understand kind of example would be Tibetans do not get passports, have no access to passports. Chinese government says that Tibetans are citizens of China, but Tibetans do not have on a regular basis access to their passports. Very few Tibetans actually ever have passports in their hands. And even those Tibetans who are supposedly the more privileged ones, the more elite ones, their passports have all been confiscated, forfeited by the government for safekeeping. They're saying we're holding these for safekeeping. And this started happening in 2013 and 14. And right now, except for the occasional, once in a blue moon kind of Tibetan who is allowed to travel to America just to make a point or something, except for those occasions, every single Tibetan, their passport is in the keeping of the Chinese government. And, it's a very clearly shows like one of the privileges of citizenship that are provided to Chinese citizens regularly who come here to study, who can go anywhere in the world, travel to Europe, Tibetans just cannot do those things, right? And I think in that kind of sense, whether it's freedom of movement, freedom of worship, freedom of learning in your own language, access to business, and entrepreneurship, those opportunities, Tibetans are in every way treated as a second-class citizen. Those are some of the reasons why we see Tibet as a colony of China very much. Just like, the Uyghurs.
Thank you, Dr. Gallo. Yeah, sorry. Dr.
Yes.
Gallo, do you want to add to that?
Yes, I wanted to add some of the points. The goal of the education boarding school is not transmitting Tibetan culture. It's mainly transmitting Chinese culture. 80% of the knowledge in the content of the curriculum is a Chinese culture. It's not the Tibetan culture. First, the second is the language of the instruction is Chinese. It's not a Tibetan. And the other one is all the education system controlled and ran by Chinese, not the Tibetan themselves. So we often say who teaching what to whom. That can define whether it's a colonial or not. It's exactly fits the definition of the colonial education. Thank you.
Thank you. While I have you, Dr. Gallo, here's a question in the Q&A for you from Dolma Kiab. This question for Dr. Jia Luo: does China's colonial boarding school policy conflict with China's new law, the law of the People's Republic of China on family education promotion, 家庭教育促进法, which was implemented January 1st, 2022. Does this policy violate the 家庭教育促进法 of the People's Republic of China? And if so, how does it violate it?
Oh, that's always from the China's constitution of the China, from the autonomous regions law, or the 10 autonomous prefectures, TAR, and the 2 autonomous counties. They have their own autonomous law, but the practice is often contradicted. That's why I see it over the 30 years experience engaging in Tibetan education system. For sure, this policy, it looks great, but on the ground, when they practice it, and they're going to turn into the other way, opposite way. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Okay, here's a question from anonymous attendee. In what parts of Tibet are the young elementary level children sent to boarding schools? Is it more prominent in the ones outside of the Tibetan Autonomous Region? So is there any difference between the TAR and the parts in the other autonomous prefectures and counties in Yunnan, Gansu, Sichuan, and Shanghai? Any difference with respect to the elementary school children being sent to these boarding schools, or is it the same every place?
The model of the boarding schooling is the same, exactly the same across the Tibetan region. Amdo, Kham, and Wizang. There's no difference. But sometimes they, based on the local social context and the situation, see the local people's reaction of their policy, they stratified the implementation of the policy. For example, in Amdo, where the mother tongue is strong in the community, they implemented their worst policy later. Or some of the context where the speaking mixed language, they strictly implemented the only Chinese language policy. For example, in 2013, it's already completely shifted the model to pure Chinese language education system. But Kham and Amdo are a little bit indifferent, remaining in the different model. Even in the same province, between the different prefecture, they still have differences. But the basic similarity is the boarding school. They're all boarding. There's no difference between them.
Tendor, do you want to say something about it?
Oh yeah, just really quickly, one distinction in terms of area or geographic distinction seems to be actually the difference between rural and urban areas. And rural areas, this seems to be a much more advanced phenomenon in the rural areas compared to city or urban areas.
So another question about from Kalden Senpa was, I've read that Tibetans coming out of the Tibetan schools in Chinese cities like Shanghai. So I don't know what, so maybe you can background me on this about Tibetan schools in Shanghai. That this person says, I've read that the Tibetans coming out of these Tibetan schools in Chinese cities like Shanghai were some of the most vocal proponents of Tibetan rights. Could we potentially see such? So that alone is an interesting thing, if somebody could comment on that. And then the question goes on to say, could we potentially see such increased vocality from Tibetans who attend these boarding schools in the Tibetan region itself? Yeah, I don't know who can answer that one.
Yeah, there's a bunch of research on that. I know personally, Du Zhiyong, he's in Beijing Normal University now. He has done the Neidi school. Chinese call that the Neidi school.
Inner provinces.
Yes.
Yeah.
That has became a important part of the Tibetan school education in Tibetan society, or the Neidi school. That's purely run by Chinese staff and the teacher. They send each school, every province, they have one school, provincial city, they have one school. That kind of Neidi school. Where those students comes from, all those local Tibetan autonomous regions or prefecture counties official who is Tibetan, who are the member of the party, their kids gone to those kind of school. Then they send one teacher, single teacher in each school. They teach in one single class for them maintaining the basic daily mother tongue ability. They only be able to develop the primary discourse with their mother tongue, no secondary discourse. I met number of those students who come Weizhang and Amdo. There's no secondary discourse with the mother tongue.
Does anybody else want to comment on this question about whether, well, first of all, so we have another question here that I think is maybe partly related to this from Duke, asking what is the main difference of education policy implementation in Tibet and mainland China? So one question I would ask is, are the kids in the Tibetan residential schools getting the same education that Han children get in Han districts, or is there a difference? But then I suppose the same. And what about other minority places? Xinjiang, Mongolia, you know, the ethnic Korean regions, you know, near North Korea, and so forth and so on. Is there a comparison there? Is this a one national template that's laid down in Han and all minority areas, or is there something different about it in Tibet? That seems to be, yeah, the question that Duke is asking. And yeah, and then, I mean, so fitting in the question of, are there actually Tibetan schools in Shanghai?
We don't call this, that's a Tibetan school. We call that the Niti Ban, means they recruit the number of the students, set a class in Shanghai. It's not a Tibetan school.
Say that again, what happens?
They recruit the number of the students, have a class in the school.
They take students from Tibet and
Yeah.
and transport them to Shanghai.
Then they have a class there. We call that the Niti Ban.
I see. And what goes on in those classes?
Same, they only send a single teacher to teach one language instruction.
Okay.
In terms of the other, yes, there are similarities and the differences between Tibetan and Mongolian and Uyghur in the school system, and with the Chinese too. The only difference between Tibetan and the Chinese school is Chinese kids can learn their mother tongue mutually.
Mm-hmm.
But in Tibet, it's different. They're forcing Tibetan to shift from mother tongue to the Chinese by implementing their compulsory policy, education policy. That's a difference. And the similarity between Mongolia and Korea, Choshen,
Xinjiang,
and
yeah.
Xinjiang are almost in the different pressure, under the same pressure.
Oh.
Under the same pressure, because they all have their mother tongue, the historical mother tongue, the rich culture, and then they force them to learn Chinese as their first language. It's a very difficult, but both kids and the parents has no choice. I give you an example. When you don't send your kids in the preschool, then later you cannot get into the grade 1. This is a hidden policy they have. This is forcing them to transit it. Yeah.
One of the reasons I think why the story that you have told here has not been known before is that everybody's paying a lot of attention to Xinjiang and to the Uyghur issue. And it raises a question of a comparison. So as far as I know, in the Uyghur communities and other Muslim communities in Northwest China, which there are a dozen different Islamic ethnic groups, they also are taking the kids and putting them in residential schools and separating them from families and teaching them in Chinese. But so my first question is, as far as you know, is this the same policy in Tibet and Xinjiang, or is there some difference? But secondly, is there anything like the education camps or concentration camps of Xinjiang happening in Tibet?
I think we earlier they started that campus in Tibet, and then that man took the position in Xinjiang. They implemented what he has. One of the teacher in Lhasa, one of my students who experienced that, they tried to shift the language of the instruction from 1 to 2nd, and then he just asked a simple question, and then they sent him in a way for 3 months. They saying, do not ask that one question. Do not question in our policy. And then the government told his family, say, oh, he is doing other duty in other place. But actually that's a campus to train them.
Does anybody else on the panel want to address some of these comparative questions that have been popping up about Tibet and other ethnic minority areas of China?
The one thing I would say about the situation of the Uyghurs, the genocide, the camps, and then the situation in Tibet, we've done a lot of advocacy and a lot of work lately with Uyghurs from all over the world, from the leading community groups, advocacy groups. And one thing that's so clear and that we've all known for a long time is that the Chinese government does care what the world thinks and is, in Tibet, there are all these hidden policies and all these careful ways that they go about even just the rollout of this bilingual education, the shift from Model 1 to Model 2, whatever you want to call it. Genla talks about the hidden policies all the time. They're sensitive to the scrutiny. They're sensitive to the international attention and the spotlight that's been on Tibet because of the international movement, because of the efforts of the Dalai Lama, of, the Tibet lobby all over the world for all these years. And so they act in a way, in a sort of careful way to try to avoid any news of what they're doing getting out. And so the policy will be on a piece of paper that's announced. The principal will get up in front of the school or the teachers and announce something, but no one's allowed to see that paper, hold that paper, take that paper. That paper has to be returned to the county education officer, you name it. And so they're really careful. And that is definitely because there's a level of protection or a level of, scrutiny that they are trying to avoid from the international community. And the same has not been true for the Uyghurs. We've known that for a long time. The war on terror, just whether it's people's discrimination, racism towards Muslim, Islam. It's just, they have not had the level of attention and support and spotlight. And in this way, in this time, at this moment, the Chinese government, I think, is just taking it to the next level because they can. And look at the time it's taken for people to figure out what was really happening there, though the Uyghurs were telling the world for a long time. And what we've argued together when we've done advocacy work together with decision makers is how important it is to have a global support movement, to have advocacy, to have, you want on some level to be pushing the Chinese government authorities, Xi Jinping, you want them to be pushing back. You want them to be, as Galen said, in some places, they do respond to people pushing back. And that is, at the very least, what we need to do with the spotlight on an issue like this. Yeah. And then Tender, did you want to just quickly, I think it's important to talk about the inland schooling program, just addressing that issue of how many of the Tibetans who went there really are the most incredibly strong Tibetan sort of patriotic characters, and because of their experience there in these schools.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, the question about the inland schooling programs. And so we have many friends who actually went to those schools, the inland program, and graduated from those institutions.
Can I ask you to, I'm still a little confused. Are those the schools in Shanghai that you, for example?
In various parts of China, not
In various
necessarily in
parts.
Shanghai.
And
Yeah, I think there
they're
are
called,
different cities in China.
they're called inland or Nadi because
Nadi.
they're taking students from the West, is that right?
Yeah,
And shipping them into
to the mainland.
the mainland
Yeah.
to educate them. So they're not actually located in the Nadi, these schools.
The kids go to the mainland and they live there.
Right,
during
okay.
the duration of the school- school semester.
The Nadi, the interior is
Yeah,
kids and not the schools, as it were.
and yeah, like I think so. We have met some of these people who were completely transformed by that system, and there was evidence that what the Chinese government tried to do with that program to some extent has backfired on them, because many of these brilliant Tibetan students who went there actually became much more aware of the inequalities, much more aware of the racism, much more sensitized. They had this kind of political awakening or political consciousness awakening that they would not necessarily have had if they had lived in Tibet in a different environment, right? So there was definitely that kind of reality, and then some of these people actually, like the question said, later on became very vocal advocates for Tibetan rights. That's true, and I think there was one major difference between that older program, the historical program, which is experimental, and what's happening now, which is industrial scale, nationwide, on a much larger scale, universal. And that distinction, that's one. And then the other distinction is, I think, actually some of the people who went to the Nadi programs, they went when they were a little bit older, like somewhere in middle school, and then they went to China, right? So they had their Tibetan language intact. It may have gotten shaken a little bit while they were in China, but once they were back in Tibet, or once they made it out of Tibet in China, right now they speak fluently in Tibetan. They never lost their Tibetan language because they were old enough when they went. And right now, the age at which Tibetan children are being enrolled in this boarding school system, it's the language that's being threatened, because that's much more irreversible than the loss of other types of cultural markers, right? And I think we speak a lot about indoctrination also, which is extremely dangerous, of course. And I think Tibetan kids who went in that program, they were heavily indoctrinated in the Nadi program. But the thing with indoctrination, political ideology, is it can change overnight. Like you can awaken overnight, it can shift overnight, and overnight you can become an opponent of the colonial state, right? Whereas in terms of language loss, that kind of change is much, much, much harder to happen. It's much more unlikely, it's much more irreversible. And I think it's the difference between kind of like an operating system and an app. The ideology is more like an app. You can download it, you can remove it, you can delete it, you can replace it, update it, but the language is like an operating system. It takes so much time and effort to update or change it. And once the operating system is like defunct and changed or deleted, it's really hard to reverse that damage. And I think that's why this particular incarnation is much more dangerous.
So we're almost out of time. We have a good question from Xiaolin Li here, which sort of relates. Lhadon just made the point that in Xinjiang, the government has said very openly that they're doing this to get rid of terrorism. They don't say that about Tibet. Their reason for Tibet, the government reason for Tibet, apparently is to inculcate loyalty, which implicitly means they're opposing separatism or something like that, independence thinking. And Xiaolin Li asks that Xi Jinping has a good memory of his schooling at the August 1st school, a boarding school for kids from mainly military officers and officials. He talked positively about it himself. So I'm wondering whether there's any reason his party and government is implementing this colonial education. So I think the implication of that question is, could it be that Xi Jinping simply thinks this is a better education and a good experience? Or what, or how do we understand the motives of Beijing in creating this, what is probably kind of expensive policy in Tibet? Is it for modernization? Does it have, is it having bad effects but has a good intent? Or is the intent itself also bad? Who wants to pick that up? Yeah,
Can I say something here on this?
please.
The outcome of the boarding school, all those Tibetan young teenagers, after they finish the high school, now they're becoming cheap labor. The government systematically transforming them into the Shanghai, Hangzhou, Suzhou, Jiangsu place, doing the cheap labor work now. I think there has no capability either in the hometown place and in the city. The only way they designed it for them is to be a cheap labor for Chinese people in company.
Okay.
Even this year, January, they transported many young people to the Shanghai and Jiangsu, Suzhou, doing the cheap labor work.
Let me ask, we only have a couple of minutes, but I'll just ask one final question, which is, what do you guys advocate as a solution to the problem? For example, that they go back to neighborhood schools. I know it's very difficult to achieve whatever we want, but what would be the solution? Or to use Tibetan have boarding schools, but use Tibetan instruction, or what? Maybe Lhadon can answer that question. What's your highest advocacy goal?
Yeah, I mean, first it is that Tibetan children should be able to receive high quality mother tongue education in their local place, as the Chinese State Council has said themselves should be the case for all children, especially very young children in China. So if Tibet is a part of China, and if Tibetans are citizens of China, then where is this for Tibetans? And of course for Uyghurs and others. But I think the key for us with the advocacy right now is just that we need to, people will know, so we need to spotlight this and have, expose that this is even happening. They're very clearly hiding, like the preschools for 4 and 5-year-olds. We can find nothing. They are hiding it. We know it's happening because of eyewitnesses. And actually a lot of little ones are in these boarding preschools now, but they're hiding it because they know it's wrong. And China's own laws, or state council decrees say it's wrong. So to on the very basic level, it's just to return. The schools are there. Maybe they weren't the best, highest quality schools, but as Gela and Tibetan education and policymakers have been fighting this fight in Tibet for decades, there's no shortage of Tibetans who exist in the system in Tibet and who are educated and who have been trying to push for high quality mother tongue education in Tibet, in all of historical Tibet for decades. And it's just a constant push and fight back against the authorities who now under Xi Jinping have doubled down on this ethno-nationalism, or really just on this plan to forcibly assimilate, or we would say eliminate, Tibetanness. The Uyghurs, the Tibetans, all of us Southern Mongolians or in Inner Mongolia, to turn Tibetans, Uyghurs, Mongolians into something that they are not, in order to eliminate resistance, in order to consolidate control. And that's the key. That's from the highest levels, we can see that. And so that's also obviously got to be really clearly stated from the international community, that not just the schools and all of this on that level is wrong, but these policies are wrong. This is cultural genocide. This is an attack on the right of people to exist and to be distinct and different from Chinese.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Lhadon and Freya and Jia Luo and Tendor for very, very informative and important discussion and an excellent report that I hope everybody will read. And we have recorded this, and so I hope that other people will be able to watch it, and we can get the word out about your important research. Thanks to those who logged on to participate and those who asked questions. Thank you very much, and we'll log off now. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Jude.
you.